It wasn't the ring that froze me. It was the silence before it. Then the phone split the air like a hammer on glass. I caught it fast. "Wolfe's office," I said. "Spill it." The voice on the line was wild, frantic. "He's dead. Mr. Brackett, on the boardroom floor. There's blood everywhere. They'll say it was me." Before I could push for details, the door slammed open. A woman in a green coat, face pale, eyes frantic, stumbled in. She clutched her handbag like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "They'll arrest me," she cried. "I argued with him, and now he's dead." Wolfe's eyes lifted from the chair where he sat like a mountain in a yellow shirt. He rarely gave the outside world more than a grunt, but the woman's voice made him shift. That was as close to leaping to his feet as Wolfe ever got. "Name," Wolfe demanded. "Clara Hastings. I'm his assistant. They'll find the knife, my knife, in him." Sirens wailed faintly outside, growing louder. I checked the clock. We had 5 minutes before the cops stormed the place. "Archie," Wolfe said. His tone was grim. "We must see this." That was my cue. I grabbed my coat, hustled Clara out, and flagged a cab like my life depended on it. We shot uptown to Brackett and Company. The lobby buzzed like a shaken beehive, executives whispering, clerks pretending to type while their ears strained. Upstairs, the boardroom doors were wide open. Inside, Brackett lay sprawled across the table, a letter opener buried in his chest. Blood soaked in polished mahogany like ink. The room smelled of panic and cologne. Clara staggered, clutching the doorframe. Every eye in the room landed on her, suspicion snapping into place like handcuffs. "Don't faint," I muttered. "They're already picturing you with the rope around your neck." Before she could answer, another shout rang from down the corridor. A junior executive rushed in, face chalk white. "There's another one, downstairs in the archive room." Gasps broke out. Clara's knees buckled. I caught her arm before she fell. 2 bodies in under 5 minutes. That wasn't a coincidence. That was orchestration. I looked around at the cluster of executives, each one stiff, sweating, hiding something. A locked room wasn't needed here. The walls themselves had secrets oozing through the cracks. The sirens outside cut sharply as brakes squealed. Blue lights strobed through the high windows. I knew exactly who'd be coming through the doors in about 30 seconds, with a cigar clamped between his teeth and murder in his eyes. "Hell," I muttered. "Inspector Kramer's about to have a field day." The wail of sirens grew until it felt like the walls themselves were shaking. Then the doors burst open and in swept Inspector Kramer, built like a bull and twice as surly. His cigar, clenched between his teeth, looked like it was trying to escape from the sheer pressure of his jaw. Behind him split a half-dozen uniforms and detectives, notebooks already open, eyes sweeping the room like searchlights. "Goodwin," he barked the instant his gaze landed on me. "Of course you're here. Where there's a corpse, there's Archie Goodwin, mucking up my crime scene." I smiled thinly. "Pleasure's all yours, Inspector. You're late. 2 bodies already. Thought you'd want a warm-up." The roar that came out of him could have cracked plaster. 2? He swung on the crowd of executives who flinched as though he'd barked directly at each of them. "Where's the second?" "In the archive room," I said. Junior exec found him. "Haven't had time for introductions, but I imagine you'll get the full tour." Kramer shoved past me toward the hallway. His men fanned out like bloodhounds, snapping photographs, chalking notes, bagging evidence. One officer yanked the letter opener free from Brackett's chest, holding it up like it was Excalibur. His shout cut through the chatter. "Prints all over it, Inspector. Belongs to her." The room pivoted toward Clara Hastings. She froze, pale as paper, eyes wide. Her hands trembled so badly she nearly dropped her handbag. The effect was perfect for anyone eager to see her strung up before midnight. "That's mine," she whispered. "But I didn't. I swear I didn't." Save it for the jury, Kramer barked. You're coming downtown. She swayed, and I stepped between them. Hold on. She entered Wolfe's office with me when the call came. Unless she's faster than light, she couldn't have done both murders. Kramer's eyes narrowed, cigar smoke puffing like steam from a locomotive. You vouch for her? Then maybe it's you I should haul in. He wasn't kidding. 2 uniforms moved closer, hands drifting toward their cuffs. I kept smiling, but my pulse kicked up. Inspector, I've been accused of plenty of things, but corporate murder conspiracies aren't usually on the list. Not yet, he growled. But we found something else. Prints, yours, on the archive room phone. It hit me like a sucker punch. That's impossible. I never touched it. Kramer's lips curled. Then explain how your fingerprints are all over the line that made the last call before McNeil collapsed. The crowd stirred, murmuring like a pack of vultures. Every eye is on me now, suspicion sliding off Clara and sticking to me instead. A perfect reversal, fast as sleight of hand. Whoever the killer was, they were clever, planting me in the hot seat. Somebody's planting evidence, I said flatly. And whoever it is, they're in this room. A voice rang out from behind. That's exactly what a guilty man would say. I turned. It was one of the board members, sweat shining on his forehead, fists clenched too tightly, too defensive, too quick to point the finger. I filed that away for Wolfe. He would use it when the time came. Kramer jabbed a finger at me. I ought to haul you in right now, Goodwin. Fine, I said, but if you do, the real killer keeps working while you're babysitting me. That sounds like a good trade? The inspector's scowl deepened. He hated me being right almost as much as he hated Wolfe. He spat the cigar into a tray and waved his men off. You stay in my sight, Goodwin. One wrong move and I'll personally drive the nails in your coffin. It gave me enough breathing room. I slipped away toward the archive room, Kramer dogging me like a shadow. Inside, the scene was worse than the boardroom. Papers scattered, drawers yanked open, and McNeil slumped over his desk, lips blue, a cup of coffee tipped onto the floor beside him. Poison, neat, efficient, fast. Whoever served it knew exactly what they were doing. I crouched, scanning the room. On the edge of the desk sat a small envelope, folded once, out of place in the chaos. I slipped it into my pocket before Kramer's eyes could catch it. If Wolfe was going to untangle this, he'd need every thread. Stop snooping, Goodwin, Kramer snapped. You're still a suspect. I stood, brushing my hands. Then I'd better find the real one fast. Otherwise, you'll be writing my obituary. We left the archive room, the crowd buzzing louder than before. Executives whispered accusations, Clara clutched her handbag tighter, and Kramer barked orders like a general on a battlefield. The whole building throbbed with panic, the kind of panic that makes killers bold. As we stepped back into the boardroom, another detective rushed up, panting. Inspector, we found this in Goodwin's coat pocket. He held up a slip of paper, a note, scrawled in sharp ink. Meet me in the archive room, alone. Signed with McNeil's initials. The room gasped again. My jaw tightened. I hadn't put it there, which meant someone else had. The killer was playing for keeps, and I was the pawn they were moving into check. Kramer's voice boomed, triumphant. Looks like you're not just snooping, Goodwin. You're luring men to their deaths. The cuffs were out again. This time even Clara looked at me with horror. The whole boardroom buzzed like a hive ready to sting. I raised my hands slowly, calculating. If Wolfe didn't step in soon, I wasn't just a suspect. I was the fall guy. And then it hit me. That was the plan all along. The killer wasn't just covering tracks. He was handing me the rope. The handcuffs' clink was about 2 inches away from my wrists when Wolfe's voice finally cut through the chaos. He hadn't left his chair, of course. He wouldn't leave it for an earthquake. But the sound of him speaking had the weight of a falling hammer. Inspector Kramer, Wolfe said, his tone calm but loud enough to slice through the buzz. "If you arrest Mr. Goodwin now, you will be aiding the murderer." The room froze. The uniforms hesitated mid-motion, their eyes sliding from Kramer to Wolfe. Even the executives stopped whispering, their fear momentarily overridden by Wolfe's authority. I lowered my hands, watching Kramer's face turn red enough to light a lantern. "You think you can order me around in my crime scene?" he bellowed. "No," Wolfe replied smoothly. "I am merely saving you from humiliation. Arrest Archie and you will discover, too late, that the evidence was planted to draw suspicion away from the true killer. The murderer is no fool. He anticipated your reflexes, Inspector. That is why Archie is being painted with such clumsy strokes." I couldn't help myself. "Thank you, boss." For a second there, I was wondering if orange was my color. Kramer growled something unprintable, but Wolfe's words had done the trick. The cuffs slid back into pockets, though the uniforms still hovered near me like guard dogs. Kramer jabbed a finger at Wolfe. "Then prove it. Tell me who's behind this." "In due time," Wolfe said, eyes half-lidded. "For now, Archie will remain free to observe. That is all I require." Kramer's jaw clenched. He hated it, but he couldn't risk being wrong in front of this many witnesses. He waved his men back, then barked, "You step 1 foot out of my sight, Goodwin, and I'll personally throw you in a cell." "Understood," I said cheerfully, though my insides were boiling. Being played like a pawn wasn't my idea of fun. The interrogation began in earnest. Kramer lined the executives along the wall like schoolboys, firing questions one after another. Who saw Brackett last? Who entered the archive room? Who served McNeil his coffee? Their answers tangled, overlapped, contradicted. The sweat on their brows told me none of them was sleeping well tonight. Wolfe sat silent, letting Kramer burn energy, but I knew he was listening to every syllable. Then came the crack. One of the board members, a wiry man named Collins, swore he'd been in his office the entire time of McNeil's poisoning. Another executive snorted, pointing out he'd seen Collins in the hallway near the archive room minutes before the collapse. The room rippled with murmurs. Collins stammered, tried to correct himself, but the damage was done. A lie caught in the open. I scribbled it down for Wolfe. Kramer pounced like a bulldog. "Why lie, Collins? What were you hiding?" I just forgot," Collins stuttered. "I wasn't near McNeil. I swear it." I caught Wolfe's eyes flick open briefly, then close again. That tiny flick told me he'd filed the lie away, catalogued it as part of his growing web. While Kramer pressed, I slipped into the hallway. The air here was cooler, sharper. My legs needed movement, and my head needed space. Every 90 seconds in that boardroom felt like a slow squeeze on my neck. As I walked the corridor, I noticed a small detail, a side door ajar, leading to the stairwell. On the floor beneath it, a smudge of dark polish. Someone had rushed through here in a hurry. Recently, I knelt, touched it, fresh. Before I could chase the thought further, a voice snapped behind me. "What are you doing, Goodwin?" It was Rowcliffe, one of Kramer's lieutenants. He glared at me like I'd just kicked his dog. "Back inside." "Now." I flashed him a grin. "Just stretching my legs. Unless you plan to chain me to Wolfe's chair." His glare didn't soften. He marched me back into the boardroom, muttering under his breath. The moment I re-entered, Clara Hastings shot me a desperate look. She'd been silent during the interrogation, but her terror was etched deep, as if the rope was already tightening around her neck. I gave her a small nod. Not much comfort, but all I could offer until Wolfe delivered the thunder. Then it came. Wolfe's voice again, rolling low and heavy. "Inspector, you're wasting your time badgering them piecemeal. The murderer is growing impatient. He may strike again if we do not proceed with precision." "Enough riddles," Kramer barked. "Say it plain." Wolfe opened his eyes fully now, fixing the room with that gaze that seemed to peel people layer by layer. Very well. Archie, tell them what you saw in the hallway. I stepped forward, holding up my notes. The side door to the stairwell was ajar, fresh smudge on the floor like someone bolted through there right after McNeil collapsed. Murmurs erupted. Collins paled visibly. Wolfe's gaze didn't shift from him. There is a flaw, Wolfe said. Mr. Collins claimed he was nowhere near the archive, yet the evidence contradicts him. He lied once. He will lie again. Collins flailed. You can't. You don't know. Wolfe raised a hand. Silence crashed down. I know this. The murderer is among you, and he is already panicking. Every attempt to frame others tightens the noose around his own neck. Tonight, I will unmask him fully. Until then, Inspector, keep your eyes open. He may yet lash out before I speak. Words settled like stones in the room. Faces tightened, whispers died. Kramer cursed under his breath, but even he felt the shift. Wolfe had seized control without lifting a finger. As the crowd dispersed under police escort, I lingered near Clara. She whispered, You believe me, don't you? I believe Wolfe, I said. And he believes the killer's just signed his own death warrant. But inside, I felt the pressure building. Wolfe had baited the trap. Now it was only a matter of waiting to see how violently the killer would spring it. The brownstone was quiet when I got back that evening, but quiet in our house was never restful. It was loaded, like a spring waiting to snap. Wolfe had returned from his orchids earlier than usual, which meant one thing. He was ready to play his hand. He sat behind his desk, huge and immovable, with a neat stack of folders at his side and a glass of beer within reach. His eyes were half-lidded, but I knew better. Behind them, gears were grinding fast. Margaret Keyes was there too, wringing her hands in her lap. She hadn't dared go home, afraid of what might happen if she left Wolfe's shadow. Fritz, silent as ever, had just finished arranging the chairs in the office into a semicircle. I didn't need a program to know what this was going to be. Wolfe was setting the stage. Archie, Wolfe said without opening his eyes. They will arrive within the hour. See that they are seated in order. Mr. Collins is in the center. I wish to look directly at him. I raised a brow. So we're skipping the foreplay, going straight to the fireworks. His lips pressed into a thin line. Do not cheapen it with metaphors. Tonight, the murderer will be named. That was Wolfe. Never one for drama, except when he was orchestrating the whole show himself. I nodded, checked my revolver, and stationed myself by the door. If the killer decided to get reckless before Wolfe could drop his thunder, I wanted to be the first and last obstacle in his way. The suspects filed in just as the streetlights began to glow. Executives, assistants, hangers-on, each one looking more worn and suspicious than yesterday. Collins came last, shoulders stiff, eyes darting. He didn't want to be here, but Kramer's men had made sure attendance wasn't optional. Speaking of Kramer, he entered with his usual storm cloud expression, puffing on a fresh cigar like it was a declaration of war. Wolfe, he growled, this had better be the end of it. It will be, Wolfe said. Sit. The room quieted as everyone settled. The semicircle of chairs faced Wolfe like students before a headmaster. He leaned forward slightly, resting his massive hands on the desk. When he spoke, his voice rolled out like a verdict. We have 4 dead men, Brackett, McNeil, Lowell, and Templeton. 4 different methods, deliberately varied to create confusion. Yet each of those methods points to one design: concealment. The killer sought not only to kill, but to misdirect. He paused. The silence was absolute. Even Kramer held his tongue. The motive, Wolfe continued, was not passion nor chance. It was business. The proposed merger with Hawthorne Consolidated threatened to expose financial malfeasance, money stolen, accounts doctored, and the men who died were those intent on forcing the matter into daylight. Murmurs rose among the suspects. Collins shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. Wolfe's eyes flicked to him and back again, deliberate, controlled. "Consider," Wolfe said, "the staged evidence. Miss Keyes's letter opener in Mr. Brackett's chest. Mr. Goodwin's fingerprints on McNeil's phone. Even a false note planted to suggest Archie lured a victim to his death. Each of these was intended not merely to accuse, but to discredit those who might expose the truth. It is the hallmark of a frightened man. One whose position depends entirely on the silence of others. I saw it happen." Collins' hands twitched on the arms of his chair, his breath quickened, and a bead of sweat rolled down his temple. He was cracking under Wolfe's words. I shifted subtly, ready to move if he lunged. Kramer leaned forward, cigar glowing. "Enough riddles. Who is it, Wolfe?" Wolfe let the silence stretch, his eyes sweeping the room, weighing each face. Then he spoke, slow and deliberate. "The murderer is Mr. Collins." The room erupted, gasps, shouts, the scrape of chairs. Collins shot to his feet, face red, eyes wild. "That's a lie. He has no proof." Wolfe's hand lifted, commanding silence. "On the contrary, I have abundant proof. You lied about your whereabouts during McNeil's death, placing yourself far from the archive, when in fact you were seen near the stairwell. You were the only one who had both the access and the motive to plant false evidence on Mr. Goodwin. And last night you coerced your subordinate to attempt a false confession, threatening her with ruin if she did not shield you. That was your undoing, Mr. Collins. Only the man controlling the company's accounts had such leverage. Only you." Collins' breathing quickened, his eyes darting to the door, the window, anywhere but Wolfe. I stepped forward, revolver in hand, cutting off his escape route. Kramer's men moved in, circling like sharks. Collins' voice cracked into a shout. "You can't prove it. Those files, they don't mean anything." Wolfe's voice boomed. "They mean everything. Records reveal funds siphoned under your authorization. The merger would have uncovered them. You killed to prevent exposure, but your frantic variety of methods betrayed you. A true professional would have chosen consistency. Your inconsistency is the loudest proof of all." The words crushed Collins like a hammer. His shoulders sagged, the fight drained. He looked at Wolfe with a mix of hatred and fear. "Damn you," he muttered. "Damn you both." Kramer surged forward, snapping the cuffs around Collins' wrists. "You'll save the damnation for the judge. Let's go." The room buzzed with voices. Relief mingled with shock. Wolfe leaned back in his chair, eyes closing as though he had merely swatted a fly. Margaret Hastings let out a sob of relief, covering her face with her hands. The finance assistant, who had nearly confessed under Collins' threats, buried her face in her purse, shaking. As Kramer hauled Collins toward the door, he paused, glaring back at Wolfe. "You could have said his name 2 days ago." "No," Wolfe said calmly. "You would not have believed me. Now you cannot deny it." Kramer muttered a curse and stormed out with his men. The room emptied, leaving only Wolfe, Margaret, Fritz, and me. Wolfe reached for his beer, lifting it with both hands. "Archie," he said, to see them out. Then closed the door. "I'm tired." Grinned, sliding my revolver back into its holster. "Case closed, huh?" "Quite," Wolfe murmured. Another puzzle concluded. And with that, he drank deeply, as though all the murders, the lies, and the chaos had been nothing more than another interruption in his day. The brownstone had a way of settling after a storm. Cases came and went, but the house always returned to its rhythm. The clink of cutlery from Fritz's kitchen, the steady hum of the city beyond the windows, Wolfe's immense presence filling the office like a mountain in the middle of a room. After Collins was hauled off in handcuffs, after Margaret's relief melted into tears, and after Kramer left with enough curses to fuel a freight train, we were left with quiet. the kind of quiet you only notice after days of chaos. I leaned against the wall, rolling my shoulders. Well, that was exciting. 4 bodies, 1 frame-up, and about 50 chances for me to end up as the city's most convenient suspect. I'd say that's a productive week. Wolfe did not lift his eyes from his beer. You dramatize, Archie. It is unseemly. Maybe, I said. But if I don't dramatize, who's going to write this down? You? I can just see it. Wolfe deduced, Wolfe triumphed, the end. Not much of a story without the running, the dodging, the occasional threat of handcuffs. His lips twitched, though he quickly buried it under his usual gravity. He set the glass carefully. The matter is concluded. Collins will confess fully once the district attorney confronts him with the documents. The company will try to repair its reputation, and Miss Hastings will be free. Margaret, still seated quietly near the corner, raised her head. I don't know how to thank you. They would have destroyed me. If not for you— You exaggerate, Wolfe said. If not for me, they would have destroyed Archie, and that I cannot permit. I gave her a smile, softening the blow. Don't take it personally. For Wolfe, saving you was collateral. Saving me, that was the point. Her lips curved into a small, tired smile. Then I'm grateful to both of you. She rose, smoothing her skirt, and extended a hand. Wolfe ignored it, sure, but I took it. She left with one last glance back, as though making sure this wasn't all a dream. When the door closed behind her, the brownstone sank into its normal rhythm again. Archie, Wolfe said, fetch the files. I sighed, but I complied, dragging the stack of folders Collins had tried so hard to bury onto Wolfe's desk. He spread them carefully, like maps of a battlefield after the war was over. His thick fingers traced the columns, the forged entries, the clever diversions Collins had slipped into the company ledgers. So much labor, Wolfe murmured, devoted to deception. Such a waste. That's one way to put it, I said, pacing. Another way is, Sen, he almost got away with it. If he hadn't gotten greedy with framing me, you might not have been able to pin him so clean. Incorrect, Wolfe said. He was doomed the moment he chose variety. Murderers believe changing methods masks their intent. In truth, it reveals their desperation. A man who kills with a knife will kill again with a knife if he is calm, but one who stabs, bludgeons, and poisons in succession, that is a man terrified of being seen. Collins was transparent. I stopped pacing long enough to grin. Transparent to you, maybe. To the rest of us, he was doing a pretty good job of making me look like public enemy number 1. You endured, Wolfe said simply. That is your function. Glad to know I've got a function, I muttered. But I let it drop. With Wolfe, that counted as affection. Fritz entered with a tray, sandwiches, beer for Wolfe, coffee for me. He placed it silently on the desk, then disappeared back into his kitchen. Wolfe poured the beer, the golden liquid catching the lamplight. He drank deeply, then sighed, content. For him, the case was over, wrapped and filed, another puzzle dismantled. I wasn't so quick to let go. The image of Brackett slumped across his boardroom table, the panic in Margaret's eyes, the moment when my wrists were a breath away from cuffs. Those lingered. Boss, I said, breaking the silence, you ever think about what happens when we lose? When you're wrong, or when the killer gets one step ahead? He closed his eyes, folding his hands over his stomach. No. That was Wolfe in a nutshell. To him, losing was impossible. His mind didn't bend in that direction. Maybe that was what made him who he was. Maybe it was what kept me from bolting when cases got too close to the flame. If Wolfe believed he couldn't lose, then maybe I could believe it too. The next morning, the newspapers were all over it. Executive arrested in boardroom bloodbath. My name was buried somewhere near the middle, usually tied to phrases like assistant to the famed Nero Wolfe. Not the worst press I'd ever had. Kramer called to gloat that the DA had more than enough to bury Collins and that Wolfe was insufferable. Wolfe accepted both statements with a grunt. I handled the rest of the calls, fielding reporters who wanted quotes and curious clients who wanted to know if Wolfe was available for their own messes. By day 3, life in the brownstone had returned to its strange equilibrium. Wolfe with his orchids, Fritz with his kitchen, and me with my typewriter, tapping out notes on the case. Outside, the city churned, already forgetting Collins in favor of fresher scandals. Inside, the air smelled of beer, orchids, and sandwiches. The truest signs of home. I finished the last line of my notes, pulled the page free, and leaned back. Wolfe cracked one eye from his chair. Satisfied? For now, I said. But you know as well as I do, the phone's going to ring again. Another body, another panic, another mess for us to wade into. He closed his eyes once more. I will be here. You will answer. And that was that. Another case closed, another killer unmasked, another week in the life of Nero Wolfe and Archie Goodwin. The legacy of the 5-minute phone call had been solved, its shadow lifted. But in this city, shadows never stayed long. The phone would ring again, and when it did, Wolfe would grunt, I'd run, and the game would begin all over. The day after Collins' arrest should have been quiet, but peace at the brownstone never lasted long. When killers are hauled off in handcuffs, they leave behind a trail of broken pieces. Reporters wanted statements, lawyers wanted denials, and shareholders from Brackett and Company wanted someone, anyone, to clean up their scandal. The city's appetite for blood wasn't satisfied by one man in a cell. It demanded explanations, motives, angles. And since Wolfe never left his chair to explain himself, all those demands ended up on my desk. I was typing up my notes when the phone rang again, its sharp jangle cutting through the calm. I picked it up, already bracing. A man's voice, strained and shaky, came down the line. "Mr. Goodwin, this is Paul Darrow, counsel for Brackett and Company. I need to speak with Mr. Wolfe immediately. It's urgent." I glanced at Wolfe, who was methodically buttering a slice of Fritz's bread with the care of a surgeon. "He's not fond of interruptions while eating," I said. "What's the crisis?" "Collins claims he didn't act alone," Darrow hissed. "He says he was forced, pressured, that there's someone else behind this. If it gets out, the entire company could collapse." That got Wolfe's attention. His eyes lifted, heavy and sharp. He extended a hand, and I passed the receiver. Wolfe pressed it to his ear. "Mr. Darrow, spare me the preamble. What precisely did Collins claim?" Darrow's voice trembled. He said there was another board member involved. Someone higher. He wouldn't name them directly, but he kept repeating, "It wasn't my plan. It wasn't mine. If that story spreads, it will ruin us." Wolfe grunted softly. "Collins seeks leniency. Desperation breeds invention. Still, such inventions are often rooted in truth. Bring me the transcripts of his statements, this afternoon." Darrow hesitated. "That's irregular. Do not prattle," Wolfe said. "You came to me for clarity. If you desire it, obey." He hung up without waiting for a reply. I leaned back in my chair, arms folded. So Collins isn't satisfied with being the villain of the week. He wants company in the dock. "Of course," Wolfe murmured. The guilty rarely wish to stand alone. Yet I suspect his babbling is not without substance. A man who kills 4 times is desperate. A man who enlists aid is doubly so. "Meaning we're not finished," I said. "Meaning," Wolfe replied, "the roots run deeper, and until they are severed, the tree remains." By 3 o'clock, Darrow arrived, pale and sweating with a file tucked under his arm. He handed it to me while shaking hands. Wolfe flipped it open, scanning quickly. Collins' statements were scrawled in uneven script, denials, Rants, half confessions. Over and over, one phrase repeated, "It wasn't my plan." Wolfe's eyes lingered on those words. "Archie," he said, "prepare a list of every board member still free. Cross-reference with those who oppose the merger most vehemently." "On it," I said, pulling the company records. Within an hour, I had a neat list of names. Harrington, a veteran with sharp elbows, Dresner, who'd been fighting the merger for months, and Keating, quiet but influential, always in the background. They all had motives, but only one had the power to lean on Collins without leaving fingerprints. "Keating," Wolfe said softly, tapping the page. "Too quiet. The sort of man who lets others bloody their hands while he reaps the reward." As if on cue, the doorbell rang. Fritz answered, then ushered in a tall, thin man with grey hair slicked back like polished steel. He carried himself with calm authority, but his eyes flickered with unease. "Mr. Wolfe, I'm Richard Keating. I heard you wished to speak." Wolfe studied him with the kind of gaze that could pin a butterfly. "I did not summon you, but I am rarely displeased by voluntary offerings." "Sit." Keating hesitated, then obeyed. His hands folded neatly on his lap. "I'm here because my company cannot survive more scandals. Collins is guilty, yes, but he's trying to drag others down with him. I need to know what you intend to tell the police." "I intend," Wolfe said, "to tell the police the truth. That you benefited most from the merger's collapse, and that Collins lacked the cunning to orchestrate such an elaborate masquerade without guidance." Keating stiffened. "That's a serious accusation." "It is not an accusation," Wolfe said. "It is a deduction. Your quiet influence, your financial stake, your proximity to each victim, it is written plainly in the pattern. Collins was the hand, you were the mind." The silence that followed was heavy, taut as wire. Keating's lips pressed into a thin line. He rose abruptly. "If you speak such words publicly, you'll destroy the company. And for what? A dead man's reputation? Think carefully, Mr. Wolfe. You may find yourself without clients if you make enemies of men like me." "Archie," Wolfe said calmly, "show Mr. Keating out." Keating left with stiff dignity, but the tremor in his hands betrayed him. When the door closed, I turned to Wolfe. So Collins wasn't lying after all. He had help. "Yes," Wolfe said, "and Keating fears exposure more than imprisonment. That is instructive." I dropped into my chair. "What's the play, boss? Hand him to Kramer now." "Not yet," Wolfe murmured. "Keating must be pressed further. Tomorrow night we will summon survivors again. Collins will not stand alone. His accomplice will be dragged into the light. And in the meantime—" "In the meantime," Wolfe said, reaching for his beer, "we wait. The guilty always act when cornered. And Keating, I assure you, feels the corner closing." I shook my head, half in awe, half in dread. Another night of waiting, another storm brewing outside the brownstone walls. Collins was behind bars, but the real puppeteer still walked free. And if Wolfe was right, we hadn't yet seen the killer's last desperate move. The brownstone has seen its share of long nights, but the one after Keating's visit felt different. The quiet was loaded, as if every sound carried a warning. Wolfe had retired to his orchids earlier than usual, muttering about the need for patience, but I knew better. He wasn't escaping. He was thinking. Patience to Wolfe was another word for control. For me, the waiting was harder. Sitting on the edge of a storm without knowing where the lightning would strike next has a way of grinding a man's nerves. By morning, the papers had turned the case into a carnival. Collins was splashed across the front page in black ink, his face twisted in a grainy mugshot under headlines screaming, "Boardroom Butcher." His protestations of innocence, his claims that he wasn't alone, were buried near the back in smaller print. But I knew Wolfe would care more about those back-page whispers than the front-page glory. They were the cracks in the facade, the ones that would widen until the whole structure collapsed. At 10 sharp, the phone rang. I grabbed it, half expecting Kramer's bark. Instead, it was Lieutenant Rowcliffe. His tone was clipped, urgent. "Goodwin, Collins tried to hang himself last night. They stopped him, but barely. Before he lost consciousness, he kept muttering one name. Keating." That one word tightened my grip on the receiver. "You sure?" "As sure as I can be," Rowcliffe said. "Don't know if it means he was confessing or just blaming someone to save his skin. Either way, Kramer's boiling. He'll want Wolfe's take." I thanked him and hung up, turning to Wolfe, who had already descended from the orchids, eyes sharp. "You heard?" I asked. "I did," Wolfe said. "Collins is finished. His attempt proves his desperation, but more importantly, his desperation names his partner. It is time." Within the hour, I was on the phone summoning the players back for one more performance. Harrington, Dressner, Keating, the assistants who lingered at the edges of power, all were ordered to appear at the brownstone that evening. Most protested, some flat out refused, but I reminded them what refusing looked like in the papers. They relented, as they always did. Even Keating confirmed, though his voice was taut as piano wire. He knew the walls were closing in. The day dragged until dusk. Fritz moved silently through the house, preparing the office with his usual care. Chairs in a half circle, lamps angled just so, the desk cleared for Wolfe's performance. Margaret Hastings arrived early, still pale but calmer than before. She clutched a small purse, eyes darting nervously, but she looked at Wolfe like a shipwrecked sailor looks at a lighthouse. When the clock struck 7, the parade began. Officers filed one by one, each carrying the weight of suspicion. Harrington blustered, Dressner snurred. Keating entered calm but rigid, his expression carved from stone. Clara Hastings shrank into her seat, avoiding their eyes. Finally, Kramer stormed in with Rowcliffe at his side, cigar blazing, voice already sharp. "This is it, Wolfe. You dragged us here again. You'd better deliver." Wolfe sat like a fortress behind his desk. He didn't rise, didn't even shift. He simply opened his eyes, heavy and commanding. "I will." The room hushed, every gaze fixed on him. Wolfe's words rolled out slowly, deliberately. "Collins has confessed in part. Not to save himself, but because guilt drove him to desperation. His attempt at self-destruction proves as much, but his mutterings name another. Richard Keating." Gasps rippled through the room. Keating's eyes narrowed, his lips a hard line. "Convenient," he said softly. "The ravings of a broken man, taken as gospel." "Not gospel," Wolfe corrected. "Confirmation. I already had you in my sights. Collins merely gave voice to the truth." Kramer growled. "Then prove it, Wolfe. I'm not hauling in another executive without more than your hunch." Wolfe inclined his head. "Very well. Archie, present the letter." I blinked, then pulled the envelope I'd pocketed days earlier, the one found in the archive room near McNeil's body. I'd nearly forgotten it in the chaos, but Wolfe had not. He gestured, and I handed it across the desk. Wolfe held it up. "This letter was written by Collins," he said, "but note the hand. It trembles, uneven. Collins was no calligrapher, but this shows strain, hesitation, and the phrasing, 'Meet me in the archive room, alone,' is not his language. Collins was blunt, coarse. This wording belongs to another, a man who cloaked his commands in civility, a man like Keating." Keating's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Wolfe pressed on. "Further, consider the finances. Collins siphoned funds, yes, but only a man with greater authority could have covered the gaps, redirected the audits, silenced the clerks. That man was you, Keating. Collins was your blade, your bludgeon, your poison. You wielded him, then sought to discard him when the net closed." The silence that followed was crushing. Faces turned toward Keating, suspicion now fully shifted. He rose slowly, his dignity intact, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. "This is slander. I built this company with my hands. I have no need to stoop to murder." Wolfe's gaze was unflinching. "And yet you did. You sought to bury the merger, to preserve your theft. You silenced Brackett, McNeil, Templeton, and Lowell. 4 men, 4 methods, one mind guiding the hand of another." I saw Keating's mask crack. His calm slipped, fury blazing in his eyes. "You think you've beaten me, Wolfe? You think your words can undo decades of power?" Kramer moved forward, hand on his cuffs. "They can, Keating, and they will." Keating's eyes darted, desperate, searching for escape. For a heartbeat, I thought he might bolt. My hand hovered near my revolver, but instead, his shoulders sagged, his voice dropping to a whisper. Collins was weak. He panicked. I only wanted control. I didn't... He stopped himself, but it was too late. The words hung in the air like a noose tightening around his neck. Kramer stepped in, snapping the cuffs shut with brutal finality. "That's enough. You're finished." The room exhaled as one. Dresner sagged with relief. Harrington muttered curses, and Clara wept softly. Wolfe leaned back, closing his eyes, satisfied. "The second net has closed," he said simply. "And this time, there will be no escape." The brownstone has a way of swallowing sound after a big reveal. Once Keating was led out in cuffs, the office seemed to exhale, the tension dripping from the walls. Fritz collected the empty glasses and straightened the chairs with his usual quiet grace. Margaret Hastings lingered near the door, her eyes wide as though afraid that if she left Wolfe's orbit, the world would collapse back into chaos. I couldn't blame her. After 2 weeks of panic, betrayal, and accusations, the brownstone felt like the last safe island in a storm. But Wolfe wasn't celebrating. He leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed, lips pressed tight. For him, victory was never the end. It was simply the moment before he sifted the ashes for anything still smoldering. I've seen him like this often enough to know. He wasn't satisfied. The case wasn't finished, at least not in his mind. By morning, the newspapers screamed with headlines, "Double arrest in boardroom bloodbath." Collins and Keating, the mastermind and his blade, plastered across the front page. The story had everything the papers loved: wealth, scandal, betrayal. For once, my name was shoved to the margins, not accused but acknowledged, a footnote to Wolfe's thunder. I should have been relieved. Instead, something in me itched. Too neat, too final. Wolfe felt it too. At breakfast, while Fritz cleared the dishes, Wolfe set down his coffee with a deliberate thud. "Archie," he said, "we are not finished." I frowned. "Collins and Keating are cuffed. That's enough for most men." "Most men," Wolfe said, "are content with appearances. I am not. Collins was malleable. Keating was cunning, but the pattern is broader. Those men were killed to protect a structure. And when a structure collapses, others fall with it." "You're saying there's a third?" I asked. "Not necessarily a killer," Wolfe said, "but accomplice, enabler, someone who helped them move pieces without sullying his own hands. If that man fears exposure, he may yet strike again." As if summoned by Wolfe's words, the phone rang. I answered, only to hear Lieutenant Rowcliffe's grim tone. "Goodwin, you'd better tell Wolfe this. Collins is dead. They found him in his cell this morning, hanging, only this time no one stopped him." The news hit like a fist. "So he finished the job he started?" "Maybe," Rowcliffe said. "Or maybe someone finished it for him. Either way, Keating's already claiming he had nothing to do with it. He's painting Collins as the sole villain, washing his hands clean." I hung up and repeated it for Wolfe. He nodded once as if it confirmed a suspicion. "The last strike," he murmured. "The net tightens, and now the weak link has been cut." Margaret gasped softly. "You mean someone killed Collins? Even in prison?" "Possible. Wolfe said. Or he may have been allowed to kill himself. Either way, the effect is the same. Collins is silent. Conveniently so. That afternoon, Kramer arrived like a storm rolling in. He slammed his hat on my desk and jabbed a finger at Wolfe. Don't smirk at me. Collins is dead, Keating's clamming up, and the DA is screaming for something solid. You promised me the truth, Wolfe. I need it now. Wolfe's eyes opened, heavy and unflinching. You have the truth. Collins was a tool. Keating was the hand, but there was another, a shadow behind them both. Kramer barked a laugh, bitter. Another? You think I've got patience left for your riddles? It is not a riddle, Wolfe said. It is an inevitability. Men like Keating do not soil their hands without encouragement. There is someone else, a facilitator, a partner in silence. Find him, and you will find the root. Kramer cursed, grinding his cigar to ash in the tray. And how do you expect me to find him? You do not, Wolfe said smoothly. Archie will. I blinked. Me? Yes, Wolfe said. Go to Brackett and Company. Speak to the clerks, the assistants, the ones who shuffle papers and serve coffee. They see what their masters do not, and they will know who whispered orders Collins could not refuse. I didn't argue. By mid-afternoon, I was back at the tower, weaving through a building still buzzing from scandal. The clerks were nervous, whispering in corners, glancing at me like I carried a noose. But one assistant, young and eager, finally cracked. She leaned close, her voice a whisper. It wasn't just Collins and Mr. Keating. Mr. Harrington told Collins what to do. Everyone knew he pulled the strings. But no one dared speak. Harrington, the loudest of the board, the man who had blustered and shouted through every meeting, pretending outrage while hiding his fear. He had seemed too obvious, too loud to be clever, but Wolfe always said, sometimes the noisiest men are the most dangerous. I returned to the brownstone with the news. Wolfe listened in silence, then closed his eyes. As I thought, Harrington was the voice that moved the hand. He feared exposure as much as Keating, but he lacked subtlety. So he shouted, hoping no one would hear the whisper beneath. Margaret clutched her purse tighter. Will he kill again? No, Wolfe said. He will try to flee. That is the last strike. When men see the gallows approaching, they run, and when they run, they are caught. That night, Kramer came back, red-faced and furious, but carrying the report Wolfe had predicted. Harrington had been intercepted at Penn Station with 2 suitcases stuffed with cash. He hadn't killed again, but he had tried to escape the noose. Kramer shoved the report onto Wolfe's desk. Damn you called it. Wolfe accepted it with a grunt. Of course. Kramer glared. And now, Wolfe said, lifting his beer, the matter is truly concluded. For once, Kramer didn't argue. He simply left, muttering. The brownstone was still there again. Wolfe leaned back, Margaret sighed with relief, and I felt the weight finally lift. The killer's allies had struck their last strike. The net was closed, but in my gut, I knew the truth. In New York, there's always another phone call waiting to jangle us awake. Always another 5 minutes before the next body drops. When Harrington was caught at Penn Station with 2 suitcases stuffed with cash, the city erupted. The papers ran it like a circus act. Third executive falls. Who will be next? Reporters couldn't decide whether to call it the scandal of the decade or the natural end of corporate greed. For once, I wasn't the headline scapegoat. I was just Archie Goodwin, assistant to the famed Nero Wolfe, quoted for one dry remark I didn't even remember making. It was a relief, if you can call anything about a string of murders, a relief. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe sat in his chair, with the calm of a man who had expected every move. His eyes were closed, fingers steepled across his stomach, but I knew he wasn't sleeping. He was replaying the whole affair in his head. polishing each deduction until it gleamed. Wolfe didn't just solve cases. He curated them, like his orchids. Fritz cleared the table from lunch, while I typed out the notes Wolfe insisted I keep. Margaret Hastings sat in the corner again, looking less like a suspect and more like a survivor. She had been coming by daily, sometimes with questions, sometimes just to sit in the safety of Wolfe's shadow. She carried herself with the fragility of someone who had been one accusation away from ruin and hadn't yet learned how to stop bracing for the blow. By late afternoon, Inspector Kramer arrived, his trench coat flapping and his scowl even heavier than usual. He didn't bother with small talk. He slammed a folder onto Wolfe's desk so hard Fritz flinched in the doorway. "There you go, Wolfe." Harrington's confession, signed, sealed, and witnessed. He admits to covering Collins and Keating, admits to ordering Collins to stage the frames, and admits to pushing Keating to silence Brackett. The whole rotten board is rotten to the core. Are you happy now? Wolfe opened his eyes, took the folder, and flipped it open with deliberate slowness. He scanned the neat pages, grunted once, and closed it. "Adequate," he said. "Adequate," Kramer exploded. 3 men dead, a 4th behind bars. Another strung himself up, and you sit there calling it adequate. Wolfe's voice didn't rise. "It is adequate because the truth is preserved. The guilty are named, the innocent spared. That is the measure." Kramer jabbed a finger at him. "The DA thinks you enjoy these games too much. Say you drag them out so you can play ringmaster. He might not be wrong." I leaned forward. "If Wolfe hadn't dragged it out, Inspector, you'd have arrested me, remember? I can still feel the cuffs in my imagination." Kramer turned on me, red as a beet. "Don't remind me." He shoved his hat back on his head. "Well, Wolfe, you've won again. But one day you'll lose. And when you do, I'll be there." "Perhaps," Wolfe said mildly, returning to his beer. "But not today." Kramer stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The brownstone seemed to sigh in relief. Margaret exhaled shakily. "It's really over now, isn't it?" "Yes," Wolfe said, settling deeper into his chair. "The last accomplice has fallen. The legacy of their 5-minute phone call is closed." Her brow furrowed. "Phone call?" Wolfe's gaze flicked to her. "The call that began this affair. Collins phoned Keating minutes before Brackett's death. A simple call, 5 minutes. That was the thread that unraveled the tapestry. Without it, the sequence of murders would have seemed chaotic. With it, the pattern was revealed. Men rarely recognize how much they betray in 5 minutes of speech. I grinned, and here I thought it was just another panicked secretary calling us in tears. "It was both," Wolfe said. "Fate has a sense of irony." Margaret smiled faintly, though the fear hadn't completely drained from her eyes. "I don't know how to thank you both." "You don't," Wolfe said curtly. "You simply live without fear." That night, the brownstone slipped back into routine. Fritz served dinner, veal with a delicate sauce, Wolfe praised with a single grunt of approval. Wolfe turned his attention back to his orchids, the true loves of his life, and I sat at my typewriter, tapping out the story of how 3 powerful men had tried to strangle the truth and ended up strangling themselves instead. As I wrote, I thought about how close I'd come to wearing chains, about how fast evidence had appeared in my pockets, my fingerprints on phones I'd never touched. If Wolfe hadn't spoken when he did, Kramer would have had me booked and the papers would be screaming my name instead of Collins. That thought lingered, heavier than I liked. Before bed, Wolfe called me into the office. He sat with his eyes half closed, voice quieter than usual. "Archie, you should know, when I insisted you remain free, it was not only to protect the integrity of the case, it was also because you are indispensable." I blinked. "Boss, if that's your way of saying thanks." I almost didn't catch it. "It was not thanks," he said firmly. "It was a fact. Do not mistake me for sentimental. I chuckled, shaking my head. Don't worry, I wouldn't dare. But as I left him to his orchids and his beer, I realized Wolfe had given me more than sentiment. He'd given me acknowledgement, rare as diamonds. And that, more than the headlines, felt like the real victory. The case was finished. The killers were named, the company shattered, the truth preserved. Yet as I turned out the light and heard the city humming beyond the windows, I knew the peace wouldn't last. In New York, it never did. The phone would ring again. It always did. The brownstone had returned to its usual rhythm by the week's end. Fritz kept the kitchen humming with the smell of fresh bread and herbs, the orchids upstairs received Wolfe's daily inspection, and I found myself at the typewriter more often than at the door. It was almost enough to make a man forget that 4 executives were dead. One had hung himself, and 2 more were cooling their heels in cells awaiting trial. Almost, but not quite. For Wolfe, the conclusion was final. He never let cases linger in his mind once the truth was laid bare. He had an enviable gift for compartmentalizing, murder and greed filed neatly away in one drawer, orchids and meals arranged comfortably in another. For me, the drawers never shut so easily. My mind replayed the phone call that had started it all, Clara Hastings bursting into the office, Kramer nearly hauling me off in cuffs. The whole thing had unwound like a bad dream, except dreams don't usually leave 4 bodies in their wake. On Friday night, Clara came last. She looked stronger than when she first stumbled through our door, less like a frightened secretary, and more like someone who had survived a storm and came out the other side. She brought a small wrapped package, which she handed to Fritz with a smile. "For the house?" she said. My way of saying thank you. Wolfe didn't rise, of course, but his voice rumbled from behind his desk. "Your thanks are unnecessary, Miss Hastings. I did not rescue you. I rescued the truth." Her eyes softened. "Then thank you for rescuing the truth. And me in the process." She left soon after, and Wolfe didn't comment further, but I noticed the way he folded her note carefully and slipped it into a drawer rather than discarding it. For Wolfe, that was as close to sentiment as the man ever got. Later that night, over one of Fritz's elaborate dinners, I tried to tease him about it. "You know, boss, you've got a soft streak you keep trying to hide. Folding her note like that, you might be human after all." "Archie," he said gravely, "stop braying. My regard for paper organization is not sentimental. It is efficient." "Sure," I said, "efficiency with perfume on it." He grunted, which in Wolfe's language meant he'd rather not argue because I was closer to right than he cared to admit. The days that followed were quiet. Kramer visited once more, only to slam his hat on the desk and declare Wolfe an insufferable egomaniac. "But damn it, you were right," he added before storming out. Wolfe took it as naturally as breathing. He never gloated when Kramer admitted defeat, but I could always see the glimmer of satisfaction in his eyes, faint but undeniable. By Sunday morning, the story had faded from the headlines. New York is merciless that way. Today's scandal is tomorrow's fish wrapping. Harrington's arrest was still making ripples in the financial section, but the public had moved on. For the brownstone, though, it lingered in the silence. Murder leaves echoes, even if Wolfe pretended not to hear them. That afternoon, as I was sorting through the last of my notes, I looked across at Wolfe and asked the question that had been gnawing at me since the start. "Boss, tell me something. You always knew, didn't you? From the moment that first phone call came, you already knew where it would lead." His eyes stayed closed, his voice low. "Not knowing. Suspected. The call was too neat, too timed. A man dies, and within minutes a client bursts in with a ready confession. That is orchestration, not coincidence. Collins was already trying to direct suspicion before the body was cold. That told me the pattern at once." I shook my head. "So while I was dodging Kramer's cuffs, you were already 2 steps ahead." As is proper, he said. If you were 2 steps ahead, Archie, you would not require my employment. That stung just enough to make me grin. Glad I'm useful, then. You are, Wolfe said with rare frankness. Indispensable, in fact. Do not let it inflate your head. The quiet after that was comfortable. Wolfe drifted back into his thoughts. Fritz brought out coffee and pastries, and the brownstone settled once more. But I knew, as surely as Wolfe knew, that the peace wouldn't last. The phone would ring again. It always did. Some new voice, panicked, desperate, dragging us back into the city's endless cycle of greed and betrayal. Wolfe would sigh, I would, run, and the game would begin again. That was our life, for better or worse. And if I've learned anything working for Nero Wolfe, it's this. You can trace a murder back to its beginning. You can pin it on the guilty, you can close the file and pour a beer, but you can never stop the phone from ringing. The legacy of the 5-minute phone call was finished. The next leg was just 5 minutes. You'd think that after a case winds down, after Kramer storms out swearing Wolfe's name like it was a curse, and after the newspapers wrap their headlines in someone else's scandal, the brownstone would finally get what it deserves: silence. And for the most part, it did. But silence in this house is never just silence. It's Wolfe's orchids humming faintly from the plant rooms upstairs, it's Fritz moving like a quiet metronome between kitchen and pantry, and it's me at my typewriter trying to shape chaos into sentences. Even when the noise outside fades, the echoes hang around like guests who don't know when to leave. It was 3 days after Wolfe had pronounced the legacy of the 5-minute phone call finished when Margaret Hastings came back. She wasn't the same Margaret who had burst into our office in a green coat with her hands shaking and her words tumbling. This one walked steadier, spoke calmer, but her eyes, those were the same, eyes that had seen death up close and still flinched at unexpected noises. She carried a small box with her, neatly wrapped, and handed it to Fritz as though it contained something fragile enough to shatter. It's for Mr. Wolfe, she said softly, but also for all of you, for keeping me alive. Wolfe didn't even look up from his desk at first. He was in one of his moods, chewing over the last pieces of the puzzle he'd already solved. But when Fritz unwrapped the package, revealing a small brass clock polished to a shine, Wolfe's eyes finally opened. A timepiece, he murmured. An unsubtle reminder that time, once squandered, cannot be restored. Margaret gave a small, wry smile. Or maybe just a reminder that sometimes 5 minutes changes everything. She stayed a little longer that day, sipping tea while I tried to keep the conversation light. Wolfe contributed nothing beyond the occasional grunt, but Margaret didn't seem to mind. She left with a calmness I hadn't seen in her since the start, and for the first time, I believed she'd truly managed to step out of the shadow of suspicion. After she left, Wolfe said nothing for a long time. Then, at last, he spoke. Archie, mark this case as closed. I tapped the last line into my notes and rolled the page free from the typewriter. You're sure? No other hidden accomplices waiting to crawl out of the walls? No, Wolfe said. The web is fully untangled. Harrington's greed, Keating's cunning, Collins' desperation, each accounted for. The truth lies bare. That is sufficient. I leaned back in my chair. You know, boss, for a while there, I thought I was going to be the one behind bars. Kramer had me halfway to central booking. You should have trusted me, Wolfe said simply. I did, I shot back. But it's hard to trust a man's mind when the cuffs are 2 inches from your wrists. For a second, I thought Wolfe might actually smile. Instead, he shut his eyes, the conversation over. That was Wolfe in a nutshell. He'd save your life, clear your name, and then scold you for not having enough faith while the noose was dangling. That evening, Kramer returned one last time, not storming, but trudging. He dropped into a chair without waiting to be asked and rubbed his forehead. You were right, Again, Harrington cut a deal. Keating refuses to speak, and the company's going under. The DA says you practically did his job for him. Wolfe grunted. I did my own job. That it overlaps is immaterial. Kramer snorted, half amusement, half frustration. You know, one of these days I'd like to win one without you showing up at the finish line with all the answers. Wolfe lifted his glass. Then you should work harder. That set Kramer off again, but this time he didn't storm out. He just sighed, left his cigar smoldering in the tray, and trudged away like a man tired of fighting a war he knew he'd never win. Later that night, after Fritz had gone upstairs and Wolfe had disappeared into the orchid rooms, I sat by the window looking out at the city. The hum of New York carried on as if no blood had been spilt, no reputations ruined. Somewhere out there, another client was already clutching their phone, about to dial our number. I thought about that first call, the panic, the terror, the lie wrapped in desperation. 5 minutes on the line and the whole city had shifted. 4 men dead, 3 reputations destroyed, 2 detectives pushed to the brink, all because of one phone call. Wolfe had solved it, yes, but the cost was carved into every word of my notes. The clock Margaret had given us ticked softly on Wolfe's desk. Its steady rhythm filled the room, reminding me that every minute mattered more than we cared to admit. Wolfe said he didn't dwell on the dead once their killers were named. But me? I wasn't built that way. I remembered. And maybe that's why I stayed, to carry the weight that Wolfe refused to acknowledge. As I closed the curtains, I whispered to myself, the case is done. But the city's not finished with us yet. And with that, I turned out the light, letting the brownstone sink back into its strange, heavy peace, knowing the next ring of the phone was never far away. The days following Margaret's last visit slid into a rhythm so familiar that you might have thought the whole business had been nothing more than a bad dream. Fritz returned to his kitchen, producing meals so meticulous that Wolfe praised them with his usual minimal grunts. The orchids upstairs demanded their share of Wolfe's attention, and he gave it gladly, his massive frame moving delicately among the blossoms as if they were the only living things worth gentleness. I found myself once again chained to my typewriter, shaping Wolfe's deductions into something that sounded like a story instead of a ledger. But cases don't really vanish. No matter how decisively Wolfe shuts the drawer, they linger in the corners, in the way Margaret's eyes had clung to Wolfe's face, in the tremor of Colin's last words, in the steady tick of that brass clock she had left behind. I'd catch myself staring at it in the quiet hours, hearing again the voice on the phone, frantic and broken. A 5-minute call, and from it sprang 4 murders, 3 ruined men, and a company in ashes. You'd think that would be enough to remind Wolfe that cases leave scars. But Wolfe never admitted to scars. He treated them as mere facts, filed and forgotten. One evening, about a week after Harrington's arrest, Wolfe summoned me into the office. The lamps glowed golden against the wood paneling, and the air smelled faintly of beer and Fritz's latest experiment with herbs. Wolfe sat at his desk, the brass clock ticking softly beside him. He lifted his eyes, heavy but sharp. "Archie," he said, "have you finished the notes?" "Mostly," I replied. "Still smoothing the rough edges. I thought maybe you'd want me to soften the parts where Kramer nearly had me in cuffs. Make you look like you swooped in earlier." "No," Wolfe said firmly. "Record it as it occurred. Accuracy matters more than vanity." "Even if the DA reads it and decides I should have been wearing stripes?" I asked. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. "If the DA cannot perceive the truth even when laid plainly before him, then the fault is his, not yours. Nor mine." I leaned back, studying him. "Do you ever worry that one day you'll be wrong? That all the deductions, the patterns, the threads, you'll miss one and the wrong man will pay?" "No," Wolfe said. His voice was calm, certain. "I do not permit myself that indulgence. Doubt corrodes logic. It must not be allowed." That was Wolfe. Unyielding, immovable, a fortress of certainty even when the world crumbled around him. Maybe that was why I stayed. Because somebody had to stand next to that fortress to remind him that people bled while he spoke of patterns. The next morning brought Kramer, looking more worn than furious. He dropped into his usual chair and rubbed his forehead. The DA's moving ahead. Keating's lawyers are already sharpening their knives, but with Harrington's confession and the books you uncovered, they don't have a prayer. It's done, Wolfe. For once, I'll admit it. You saved me from locking up the wrong man. Wolfe inclined his head slightly, the closest he ever came to modesty. It is satisfactory, then. Kramer gave a short, bitter laugh. Satisfactory. You're insufferable, Wolfe, but damn it, you're good. He stood, shoved his hat back on his head, and stomped out without another word. After he left, I looked at Wolfe. That almost sounded like a compliment. Bah, Wolfe muttered. A confession of defeat, not a compliment. Still, the office felt lighter after that. For once, Kramer's anger had cooled into something close to respect, even if Wolfe would never name it. That night, I sat at the typewriter for the final time on this case. The words came slower than usual. Maybe it was fatigue. Maybe it was the weight of everything that had happened. I kept hearing Margaret's voice, Colin's muttered pleas, Keating's furious denial, and beneath it all, the steady rhythm of that clock. 5 minutes of conversation stretched into weeks of blood. I typed the last line, rolled the page free, and laid it on Wolfe's desk. He didn't look up, but his hand reached out, heavy and precise, and pressed the page flat. Good, he said simply. That will do. I leaned against the desk, watching him. So that's it. Case closed. File it away. Forget it ever happened. Yes, Wolfe said. That is the proper order. Not for me, I said. I'll remember every second of that phone ringing, every time Kramer nearly cuffed me, every lie that nearly stuck. 5 minutes can ruin a life, Wolfe. Sometimes it ruins 4. Wolfe's eyes opened, regarding me with that steady, immovable gaze. That is why we must be vigilant, Archie. The world squanders truth in minutes. We must restore it, no matter the cost. There wasn't much to say after that. I turned out the lamp, leaving only the tick of the brass clock and Wolfe's steady breathing in the room. The city outside never slept, but for one night the brownstone held its peace, and I knew it wouldn't last. It never did. The next phone call was out there, waiting, only 5 minutes away.